El Mencho is a very interesting figure and character.
There were gunfights against also the army and members of the National Guard in Mexico.
Building an entire branding around the operations of the cartel with uniforms, logos.
He's someone who has been wanted, but I think the timing, of course, raises questions.
And there is right now a massive question mark around who's gonna take over the organization.
This could lead to more violence in the country and specifically some of the states where Jalisco Nueva Generación operated. An operation conducted mostly by the Mexican army to arrest El Mencho resulted in his death. They were on his way to capture him. There was a gunfight that broke out from his people trying to prevent his arrest, and he died on the way to, being transferred.
The events that led to the elimination of El Mencho, the leader of the Cartel Jalisco New Generation, are, I would say, quite classic in the way this type of operations are conducted in Mexico. So you have a long buildup of confidential information and intel coming from the Mexican forces, the Mexican security apparatus, collaboration with the US, which is quite classic on intel sharing and these massive operations. And then you do have the launch of the operations per se. In this case, the operation was conducted in a very remote, rural area of the state of Jalisco and in western Mexico, which is, again, part of what we have seen in the past years. El Mencho is a very interesting figure and character in the some sort of old god or old generation of drug cartel leaders in Mexico. El Mencho was in business for the past 40 years almost. What's interesting again about El Mencho is his ability to move within many different criminal organizations in Mexico, probably at least a dozen, working in different areas of Mexico. Again, being involved in very pioneering trafficking work in terms of drug trafficking, the connection with Asia on chemicals, synthetic drugs trafficking to the US, on top of course, like controlling cocaine trafficking and other drug trafficking, like more in a more classic way. El Mencho, who had in the past been connected to many other criminal organizations in Mexico, took a bit of everything from his colleagues and then rivals in different criminal organizations and built a very, very diverse and flexible criminal organization and very innovative criminal organization. It took ideas and processes from the Michoacan cartels, the Familia Michoacana and the Caballeros Templarios, the Knights Templar, in the sense that he was able to build a very prominent and propaganda around the communication of the criminal group, not him himself, but the criminal group, by posting messages on social networks, using journalists to communicate better, building an entire branding around the operations of the cartel with uniforms, logos, then building very specific commando elite units within the cartel. And this comes from the Michoacan groups, which he knew very well because he kind of grew up within them, but also from his connections and then rivalry with the Zetas group in Mexico. And the Zetas were not a territorially binded drug cartel. The Zetas were like a brand, if you wish. You had Zetas operations in dozens of Mexican states for almost a decade or two, but they were also able to just absorb, co-opt, or develop local criminal cells in different towns, different regions of Mexico, but also abroad, especially in Central America, in Guatemala and in Honduras. And this is exactly what the Jalisco New Generation cartel was able to do for the past 15 years.
Being associated as a leader of Jalisco Nueva Generación, he's someone who has been wanted, but I think the timing, of course, raises questions. Since President Sheinbaum came into office, a very different tone of cooperation with the United States. And we do know that El Mencho has been wanted by the U.S. And, we saw the comments from the U.S. press secretary also commenting about his profile and how he's seen in the U.S. And so in that way, it matters to show and provide an action that is very readable to the U.S. government against a person that, again, the U.S. government also wanted to target. The initial response, and it's important to also put into context that we have seen similar responses at other times, for instance, with the Sinaloa organization. Essentially, there were gunfights against also the army and members of the National Guard in Mexico. And so there was a response from the criminal group after this reported death. It was not, something that happened and then the group went away, but we saw essentially the group responding.
The cartel responded to the death of El Mencho, I would say, in a disturbing and very challenging, but unfortunately in a very classic way. So basically, when you have a massive military or police operation against the cartel, or if you have a massive operation led and launched by the cartel in a specific area, the drug cartels have been using this tactic of taking large trucks or buses, putting them in the middle of the roads and the avenues and the boulevards or the national roads or the highways around the area or next to the area where they would operate or where they were being chased, and set them on fire, which is a very cheap and easy way to paralyze the operations of the police, the army, but also to produce a very spectacular show of force and send a very strong message to the government.
I think symbolically for law enforcement agencies, as we are seeing both in the US and Mexico, this matters a lot, right? Precisely because he has been in the top wanted lists in both countries. I think, however, and unfortunately, the evidence shows that this kind of Kingpin strategy is not particularly useful or robust in weakening the activities of a criminal group or eliminating a criminal group. I think now, especially in the case of Mexico, with 2 decades of evidence, we know that, these removals don't make a criminal group go away. And so while there may be some degree of disruption, over time, criminal groups have also adapted to the Kingpin strategy, and they have become much more horizontal to the extent that, there may be a degree of disruption, but to think that this group is going to go away would be, I think that's not going to happen.
You do have a sense that there is a very, very strong organization around El Mencho, around the leadership of El Mencho, which is quite classic within a criminal organization in Mexico. But the thing is that his inner circle and trust circle has been decimated over the past years. There is right now a massive question mark around who's going to take over the organization. And the questions there are interesting and relevant for Mexico, but not only, because we can imagine that there might be, as it happens with this elimination of drug cartel leaders, there might be an internal fight within the inner circles to see who is going to take over the drug cartels. But the fact that the Jalisco New Generation cartel has also expanded through this franchise model could potentially provoke disruptions in dozens of Mexican states and cities, and also outside of Mexico in territories such as Guatemala, Honduras, and even South America, because those franchised cells were integrated into the New Generation cartel in a connected but loose way. Jalisco New Generation is really interesting in the way they've been using what was referred too for the Zetas back in the day is the brand. It was, including in Mexico, like people used to use the term la marca Zeta, the Zeta brand. And the fact that you would travel, you would go around Mexico and in so many different states as Tamaulipas, Veracruz, Michoacán, Chiapas, and even like in Central America, you would see a letter Z graphed onto a wall, for example, in the streets. Whether it was real control or presence or not, it would show that the Zeta brand was actually useful, powerful, and attractive for local criminal cells. And for the Zetas to be able to expand this way was really extraordinary, and it changed absolutely the panorama of Mexican drug cartels, because they were able to expand. And Jalisco New Generation did exactly the same. You would see in, again, dozens of towns and states in Mexico and elsewhere, the 4 letters, the CJNG letters, graphed on and tagged on walls in the streets. And this is also why actually in Mexico people used to refer to the cartel as the 4 letters cartel. Like it felt like a massive and very compelling branding, and they were using it quite a lot actually.
I think it's very important to see that there's a very different tone now in actual actions between the Sheinbaum and the López Obrador administration. I do think this is important on 2 levels at least. One is because it should bring again to the forefront the conversation of firearms trafficking. A lot of the reason that we're having this conversation of the firepower capacity of Jalisco Nueva Generación, of course, relates to firearms trafficking, which is part of the bilateral agenda. And the other thing that I would say is it should also lead to questions about, how to reduce levels of impunity in Mexico, right? Because I don't think, now after 20 years of this type of violence, what we know is that killing a purported leader of a criminal group is not seen necessarily as a justice process in the country. And there's more that needs to accompany that than just, these high value targeting operations in the country. The very recent case of Sinaloa, what happened with the arrest of Zambada there, also a known person and also very much a wanted man in Mexico and the US, tells us, is a bellwether of what's to come. What we do know, and I think the concern that we have, is that this could lead to more violence in the country, and specifically some of the states where Jalisco Nueva Generación operated. And so now the big question for the Mexican government, I think, is not only about, having this operation be successful as they describe it, but rather if they're going to be able to contain any violence that could potentially fall out. And I think we should also be cautious in the sense of thinking about the timing of this violence. When the Zambada arrest happened, there was a bit a month of time before we really saw a spike in violence. And so similarly, hopefully this does not lead to more violence, but I think that's what we should be concerned about, how communities could potentially be impacted because of this action.
I think unfortunately what might happen is the second phase of this is again this very open question about what is going to happen with the cartel, and what is going to happen with the structures, and what is going to happen within the cartel and vis-a-vis rival groups. Unfortunately, what we might see is the explosion of localized pockets of violence and localized conflicts between rival groups around Jalisco New Generation in different parts of Mexico, and also unfortunately maybe in Central American countries like, again, Guatemala and Honduras, where the cartel was especially present and active. And this is what we might see for the upcoming, unfortunately, days, weeks, but also as we see with the Sinaloa wars, maybe for a month or years to come. So this is, I would say, the likely scenario, unfortunately, for the recomposition of the group.